All right, good morning. Thank you for staying through the last day. I think, wait, Melissa, are there sessions after this or is this it? This is it. So you made a good choice coming here last. We saved the best for last, just kidding. So first of all, some housekeeping things. Raise your hand if you have seen me on Zoom or you've attended any of our trainings together. Like big raise your hand, not little raise your hand. Yeah, okay. So here's what I am thinking. Those of you that just raise your hand have a lot of knowledge of what we've been through with Tier 2. And so I'm going to teach to that level. So if you did not raise your hand, it probably means that you are missing some foundational information, and it may feel like you have some questions or I need to back up, which is totally fine. So if that happens, just raise your hand or speak up and say, can you explain that again? Because what we have, I'm trying to explain, is that we have a mixture of people. So I have actually, whoever raised their hand, I've been working with them and training with them for a year on this. And so this is more advanced level Tier 2. So they've been through the basic Tier 2. And this is more advanced level Tier 2 information. So if you didn't raise your hand, there is still lots here for you to get. I will show you some articles for reference that you could also read. And then at the very end, all of this is in a book now, so I'll show you how to get the book. Otherwise, I think maybe Melissa could help us figure out if you want the Tier 2 foundational part, the backwards part that we've kind of gone through with those that raise their hand, we can figure that out too. So all of that to say, there's plenty here for you. I don't think you'll need to be taking pictures of slides because they should all be in your notes in the app. So raise your hand if you can pull those up. I have a few good, okay, how about let's do this. Raise your hand if you cannot pull up those notes on the app. Oh boy, there's a lot of you. So what do we do about that?
We'll make sure that they're updated if it's not right now.
Okay, and also I think my email's on the last slide, so you all don't have to take pictures and write everything down. We will get you the information, and I will email you the PDF when I get to the airport, if that's what is best for you and the app's not working.
Yeah, we can take care of that.
Okay.
You can reach out to a patent person, but we'll make sure that it's updated in the app. Sorry about that.
Okay. I think it was a little bit spotty on maybe when you downloaded those slides or whatever. So, okay. Welcome, everyone. This is very typical that you will all pack in the back. I don't know why we humans do that, but you are welcome to come forward. There are plenty of seats for anybody that's on the floor, probably charging your devices or whatever. So just wanted to say that. I welcome you or invite you to come forward. This is a 2-hour session, but it is a workshop. So I'm actually going to give you several times in which you're going to turn and talk to your neighbor. If you came here with a school team member, that is fantastic. Maybe you have a new friend sitting next to you instead, and you can share with that person as well. So because it's a workshop and not just what we call sage on the stage, me talking for however long, I'm going to turn it back to you all to do some work to get your mind thinking about your local context. Because, of course, I live in Alabama, and I could tell you all day long exactly how to do this, but I want you guys to be able to turn around and interpret what that looks like in your schools, okay? All right. I also have a cold that seems to be getting worse and not better, but it's not COVID. So I guess you don't have to get any closer anyway if you want to stay away from my cooties. So excuse my coughing and nose blowing or whatever we have to do here. It's just part of being a human. So I think I introduced myself pretty well the other day, but in case you weren't there the other morning and you were still hungover from your candy consumption the night before or traveling in, I'm a professor at the University of Alabama. I also direct a research center, and we do all of the TA across the state of Alabama for PBIS. So we train all of our schools and districts in PBIS. We also work in substance use and misuse prevention, bullying prevention, those sorts of things. And so our model for Tier 2, typically, and all of this is kind of like with an asterisk by it, taking away the COVID years, because that was weird and difficult, but typically for Tier 2, we do 2 days of training, and then we do follow-up monthly coaching. because there's a lot of information on what it looks like, what the interventions look like, but then once you get going, there's always questions and needed ongoing support. So just know that if it looks like a lot, we have worked for 10 years on this framework for Tier 2, and if we could have made it any easier or any simpler for you, we would have. It's just that Tier 2 is a critical stage for social emotional behavioral intervention, also academic intervention, critical time. And there's no magic potion that we can kind of pour over a student's head and voila, everything is fine. So it is kind of complicated. There are different social emotional behavioral needs. You'll notice that I don't just talk about behavior. That's a very kind of 2010 PBIS Center way of looking at it. We're looking much more comprehensively now at social needs, emotional needs, behavioral needs, especially around those that connect with mental health and school-based mental health. So you'll see in Tier 2, we really need to connect in there too. You'll also probably start putting together that if you already have an academic team working through RTI and supplemental academic instruction, sometimes that's called a problem-solving team, you can link this right in with those folks as well. A lot of times what we see is students who have co-occurring academic and social emotional behavioral needs. It makes a lot of sense why we would see that. If you start with, it's kind of a chicken and the egg situation. If you start with a behavioral need and the student is suspended several times or sent to the neighboring classroom, now we're starting to miss instruction and we can start to see instructional gaps. In the other reverse, if you have a student who doesn't come to school ready and on grade level with reading, they probably will not like participating in your reading instruction and reading out loud, and they'll figure out quickly how to get out of that, which is by misbehaving. And so the two kind of tie together quite often. So as much as we can integrate, and I know this conference has an MTSS approach, and that's really where the magic starts to happen, is when we can get into Tier 2, we're identifying students who have needs in an academic, social, emotional, behavioral area, and the team gets to decide based on data what the plan is for that student. Okay, any questions so far? All right. Okay, so this is a huge team effort, this specifically the adapting part. So I'm going to get to the adapting of interventions part, and just remember there's a whole foundational piece of Tier 2 that led us to here. So the adapting work in our framework was really done by this is who I call my work wife, Allison. She works at the University of Iowa. We've been working on the framework together we were both at Vanderbilt at the same time in 2010, so it's been a while. And then Caitlin and Brittany have also helped us with the adapting part and how to take Tier 2 interventions and think about how we can adapt them for the students that we're actually implementing them with. So who has seen this circle and these three circles inside? Yes, it's a very common slide. If you've ever been to the PBIS National Forum, if you've ever been to APBS, the Association for Positive Behavior Support, if you've ever been to the PBIS.org website, you've also probably seen this. So usually this is discussed in terms of Tier 1. So we have our student outcomes, that's what we're really trying to drive, and that happens with this integration between systems, data, and practices. So at Tier 1, we're talking about systems for teaching expectations, systems to responding to unwanted behavior, systems for classroom management, those sorts of things. Data, we're talking about office discipline referral data, attendance data, fidelity data at Tier 1. And then our practices, teaching expectations, norming them to everyone in the building, defining them for all the settings in the building, reteaching those throughout the year, those sorts of things. So at Tier 1 is where we're really usually talking about this. But in general, we can apply this to Tier 2 as well, because this logic should stand across Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. So we're really talking about how are we doing this? What does it look like? What's our plan? What are we actually doing? And is what we're doing working? So that our data should drive that piece there. So I just went over kind of what that tier 1 piece looks like then. If you're new to that, you can kind of reverse and make sure that your school has tier 1 in place and that those pieces are in place. One important thing we talk about a lot at tier 2 is that if you don't have tier 1 in place with fidelity, I talked about fidelity the other day, what you're going to end up doing is over-identifying for tier 2. So you'll actually accidentally identify students who look like they have tier 2 needs because you didn't have the tier 1 practices in place that would have responded to their kind of very minimal needs at tier 1. So you'll end up over-referring for tier 2 if you don't have that first left-hand column in place first. So do make sure you go back and check all of those. And as we move to tier 2 though, we're really starting to think through those systems, data, and practices for tier 2 and what that looks like. We have a lot of schools that say, well, we already have a tier 1 PBIS team, can't that just be the tier 2 team? No, totally different systems, data, and practices. So there's no reason for that same team to be meeting. Your team at tier 1 is a school-wide team that's looking at school-wide data, not necessarily individual students. It has to be representative of the whole school, and they're not making individual plans based on those data. They're actually making school-wide plans. Come on in. You want to find a seat? Yeah. So they're actually making plans to reteach expectations in the cafeteria, reteach expectations in the hallway, change the procedure for arrival or dismissal, those sorts of things. So the data that they're looking at then is way different than what we're looking at with tier 2. At tier 2, what we see work really well are an elementary school or grade level teams. We want teams of people talking about students that know that student, that also know what grade level social, emotional, behavioral well-being looks like at that grade. So that works really well in elementary. Just as everything does, it gets a little bit complicated in secondary. So if your middle school can also work in grade level teams, that would be great. I know it gets really hard to do that in high school. Sometimes they'd have departmental teams. We just try to shift at the local context to what works with a team at the high school level. But in general, you do need administrative leadership there, just like you do at tier 1. So you need a principal, assistant principal. The reason for that is you're going to be making intervention decisions that you need the green light for. So you don't want to spend time making an intervention plan for a student and then just have the principal say, oh, no, our mentoring program is full up, we can't add that student, and now you have no plan. So that's why we have administration at present at tier 1 meetings and tier 2 meetings. We're going to have to do a lot of communication at tier 2. So you're going to make a plan as a team that needs to be communicated out to the grade level team and to the family and the caregiver of that student, and for some of our secondary students, to the student as well. So when we're talking about data at tier 2, we're going to consider tier 1 data. So all of the things that you have over here, we can consider that about that individual student. We also really need to be looking at screening data. So backing up to the foundational tier 2 work, you would be doing universal screening around social, emotional, behavioral needs to be able to identify students who have a tier 2 need. That is our main entry point for tier 2, is screening. It usually happens around September, October, so it's not too late if you want to add that. I think a lot of you all are used to either the SABRS or the SRS-SIE. We talk a lot about the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, the SDQ. If you want to Google that, they have it free. It's 25 items. Again, it's all in kind of the foundational work. So we're going to start with screening data. That's going to point us to an intervention category. It's also going to point us to how intensive this need is. And then as we go along, meeting every month about this student as a team, so this team is going to meet monthly to discuss student progress. That's when we need progress monitoring data, which is very different data than the school-wide data that we were looking at tier 1, excuse me. Our practices are also very, very different. This is another reason why you need a totally different team. So we're actually implementing evidence-based tier 2 interventions that were designed to be implemented in small groups and for students with targeted or identified social emotional behavioral needs. Tier 1, again, is what everyone gets. You don't have to have a targeted need to get Tier 1. Everyone gets that, and we layer on Tier 2 for students who are identified through screening to get additional interventions. So those look different as well, which is another reason it's kind of two separate teams and systems that we're working with. So let's go to what are Tier 2 interventions. How would we even know and start to categorize something that you may read about in a journal article or see at a conference and know, is that a Tier 2, a Tier 1, a Tier 3, a Tier 2 plus, a Tier 4? Outside the triangle, we have schools in Alabama that the triangle is Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, and then special education happens outside of the triangle. So based on how yours are, in general, we have the following rules about what is Tier 2. They have to be readily available. So this is not something that should take a team an hour to create an individualized intensive plan. It shouldn't take extra people to implement, that sort of thing. We always want our Tier 2 supports aligned with our Tier 1 expectations. So when we're talking about replacement behaviors, we're talking about skill building, we're talking about emotional regulation, we're going to tie that back to our be respectful, be responsible, be safe, or whatever you have at Tier 1. You need to be able to deliver Tier 2 in small groups. This is not a very popular part of my message to you, but I do have to tell you that Tier 2 does not come with any extra people. So you have to use the people that are already there and figure out Tier 2. So it is very unlike special education where you get to move it over to people who do this and they know IEPs and they know intensive individualized intervention and they may even have special classrooms. This is general education. These are general educators who, just like if a student had math calculation deficit or oral reading fluency need, would have to pull students and figure out how to supplement their needs at Tier 2. So this is not coming with anything extra, and that means it has to be really efficient. So we have to be able to deliver this in small groups of students, very quickly, readily available, and require minimal resources and commitment. We can't design anything too elaborate because that wouldn't fit at Tier 2. We can't do that with the amount of students that you would be serving at Tier 2. Typically, we're talking about Tier 1, and let me say, this is before COVID, so we're in post-COVID days, which is a little bit different. We're usually talking about Tier 1 being all students need for about 75 to 80% of your building. Tier 2 then would be about 15 to 20% of your building, and Tier 3 should be 1 to 5% of your building. Post-COVID, I'll give you a little bit, so in case you're panicking because that's not what your building looks like. Post-COVID, we're looking at Tier 2s more like 30%, sometimes 35, 40%. And then hopefully we can do really well at Tier 2, but it looks like Tier 3 is growing as well. So just in case that's what your experience is at your school, you're not alone. We're seeing a lot of that. Okay. Has to be easy to implement. We don't need anything, and nothing that I'm going to tell you about requires like a BCBA or a master's degree in psychology or anything like that. All of the interventions that we picked for our framework are not only evidence-based, but they're also things that any grown-up and sometimes peers could implement. So when you're thinking about who could do this, that's really helpful when you can open up the who is going to do this too. Custodial staff, grandparent volunteers, front office staff, librarian, football coach, nutrition staff, anyone in the building should be able to pick up these interventions and implement them because they are not complicated and difficult. Notice I didn't say they're easy, but they're not complicated. So we have to make sure that multiple interventions are available. This is also not a very popular part of the message because a lot of times when we go to the schools, we say, okay, what are you doing at Tier 2? And they say, oh, we got Tier 2 figured out. Everybody gets check in, check out, which is a good start, but that doesn't exactly work. So it turns out you need multiple interventions because they have to be matched to that student's area of need. Again, we're talking about social, emotional, behavioral needs. They're not all the same. And the interventions, going back to what I was talking about the other day, the interventions that those researchers developed, they developed them for a specific area of need and a specific, we call them mechanisms, so they're working on a specific thing. So locus of control for hyperactivity, inattention, all of the things that we're trying to change in the intervention are supposed to be matched to a student that has that need. So if you just use one, you're going to be kind of using a sledgehammer instead of a more precise kind of a tool. So we want to be making sure that we have the ability to match. That goes back to screening. So with the SDQ, we can match across 4 different subscales that the SDQ shows you. And I'll show them here in a little bit. But it actually brings down our social, emotional, behavioral needs down further into hyperactivity and attention. There's a whole category of interventions that just work on locus of control, which is what students with that need. We have a whole category of interventions that are for emotional needs. So thinking about your school counselors, very different to have a feelings chart and talking about coping with feelings than staying on task, right? Those are 2 totally different needs. So we wouldn't use the same intervention for those 2 totally different needs. Social, we actually break it down into students with peer problems, so specifically peer-to-peer social issues. And then we have some amazing friends that don't discriminate who they have social problems with. It's just any human. So adults, same age peers, and even younger children. So we can kind of broaden out to that as well. And then we have a whole category of what most people think of when they think of behavior. They're thinking of discipline. So anything that's in the code of conduct where you're talking about something that's making your environment unsafe, so physical aggression, verbal aggression, the D words that I dislike very much, defiance, disorderly, disrespect, that's probably in your code of conduct that you should go back and look at. And all the things in the code of conduct that matches to all the check-in, check-out variations. So when someone tells us we have check-in, check-out, we say that is actually a great start, because a lot of what your needs are in your building and what you're paying attention to, that part's important, is those that end up in ODRs, office discipline referrals. Those all match to check-in, check-out variations. So we keep that. That's great. That's a great foundation. But you're going to under-identify. Your ODRs are not going to find your students with emotional symptoms. They're quiet, withdrawn, don't have friend groups, visit the nurse often. They're not going to the office for all those things, but they have a need, and unless we're screening, we're not going to find that need. Same with hyperactivity and attention. Those usually show up in academics. So bad grades, not completing homework, losing homework, not attending to class, and kind of these minor disruptions, talking, not raising hand, that sort of thing. That shows up in more academic data. So again, if all you're looking for in Tier 2 is through your ODR data, you're going to miss them as well. And then you're going to probably lump in conduct and social, because if someone had a fight in the cafeteria, you're just going to assume that they have aggressive issues. But actually, if you unwind it a little bit, it turns out that they have problems with social conflict, and they need reteaching of how to handle conflict, how to communicate properly. So that's more of a social issue. Okay, any questions so far? You probably have them, and you're just not raising your hand. I promise I'm happy to answer questions. Okay. All right. Here's your first activity. So if you have a team, if you have someone here from your school, that's amazing. If you want to work on your own, that is also totally acceptable. But if you'd like to meet up with a friend around with you, you are welcome to use your social skills and make a new friend this morning. So we're going to take about 7 minutes, and I just want you, based on everything that I've said so far, with the requirements of what it looks like to actually be a Tier 2 intervention, I want you to think through what you already have in your building. You have more than you think you have. You may not be applying it to Tier 2. You may be using it for everyone, or you may be randomly giving it to students who you think need it, and you just need to restructure. So List any of your Tier 2 social emotional behavioral interventions and check off if they fit these criteria here. You might find a few that have most of these criteria but not all. So that's a little place where you can write yourself a note and think through, is this really a Tier 2 intervention? So 7 minutes on that. This is your time to work. It's a workshop, so I actually do want you on task if you can remain on task. If you have to check your email or TikTok really quick, do that too, but also get back to our activity so that you walk away with something, okay? 7 minutes on that one. All right, we will get back together. I hope you have your list in front of you. I hope you enjoyed talking to another human this morning, whether they were on your team or not. That was really good social interaction in this social process that we're all working through. So thank you. I'm going to ask you to do the next step of this, and I'm going to show you in a minute what it'll actually look like, but I'm going to walk you through it first. So I want you to take that same list, and hopefully your list is not empty. If your list is totally empty, I got you. It's okay. Let's just pretend like it's a wish list. And you wish these interventions were in your building. So you can kind of work from there. Our next step is I want you to think through those interventions that you have checked off as Tier 2 that we could assign and match to student need. And I want you to think through what categories those match to. And in a minute, I'm going to keep this slide up here, but I'm going to walk you through it first, okay? So I want you thinking through, does this intervention that we have, a peer mentoring program, what does it actually work on? So when we're talking about our social category, we're talking about anything that's related to social skills, SEL programs. So if you have a universal school-wide SEL program that everyone gets from the school counselor or the classroom teacher, can you reteach those skills in small group? Then you already have something there. So anything also that would be like your behavior contracts that are pointed towards social issues that students might have. Under your emotional symptom, you're going to put anything in that category that has to do with feelings, thoughts, and emotions, not necessarily external behaviors. So anything that we call internalizing behaviors. If you use the SSRS-IE, the only thing it will give you is the I or the E. It's not my favorite, but if you already have that installed and it's already normed to your district and your school, you do not need to stop using it. Just know that any students that are identified under the I, that's internalizing, that will be matched to emotional symptoms. So list out there anything that your school counselor, social worker, school psychologist may have. Even some classroom teachers that are skilled at calming corners, emotion regulation, feelings identification, those sorts of things. So typically it would be your school counselor, but anything individual, small group, emotion, feelings, thoughts, okay? For your conduct category, I want you using anything that you use to respond to in a therapeutic, restorative way, not in a punitive way. So don't put suspension and alternative school as an intervention. That is just a punitive consequence. It is not an intervention. So don't put that on there. But anything that you use to respond to ODR issues. So if you already have check-in, check-out, if you have a restorative panel, that sort of thing. And then the last category is your hyperactivity inattention category. These behaviors show up typically only in the classroom. They may be a little wild and loud going down the hallway, a little extra movement, but this is what you would see in class while you're teaching. So anything related to being on task, setting goals, work completion, raising your hand, organizing your materials, those sorts of things, anything around self-monitoring, and those academic-related behavioral skills would go in that category. Okay, so now I want you to build your own matrix based on what you have or your wish list. That's fine. You can kind of have like a FAO Schwartz Tier 2 wish list. And you're going to build your matrix next. let's see how much time. Okay, so this one's 5 minutes. We're going to move a little faster. So your domains go across the top. Those are typically your hyperactivity and attention, conduct, emotional, peer problems, and any human problem. You could have 4 domains. That's totally fine. We don't want 1. That would be a problem because that would mean everyone gets the same thing. So first, write in your domains, your buckets. So these are fine if you want to use those. The next thing we want you starting to think through with that list, you're going to first put them in, like, what bucket do they go in? But you can see here that we have different levels that go in that bucket. And what that is actually levels of intensity of interventions within the same category. So this is where if you were not listening to me for an entire year and tortured by my Zoom meetings, you might not know what I'm talking about. But I'll try to walk you through it quickly. So we have least intensive is in that first level. More intensive interventions go down this way. So we always want to start with the least intensive intervention necessary, especially a tier 2. So if you can start with a weekly behavior contract, that is one person checking in with a student on Monday and again on Friday and a piece of paper, start with that one rather than something much more intensive like check in, check out, where you're meeting with a student twice a day and getting feedback all throughout the day, and there's this point system and all that. Okay, so we're actually going to fill in out of your list from that bucket the least intensive possible, and then we're going to fill in 1, maybe 2 more on more intensive. So here's your quiz, and for my tier 2 scholars, you better know this answer, all right? All right, so if this is tier 2 and least intensive is here, and this big chunk is tier 2, so we're going from less intensive to more intensive this way. So what would be up here? Tier 1. Bing, 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 bing. Woo. All right, so if that's tier 1, pretend like that's up here somewhere. Okay, then here, we're going down this way through tier 2. Things aren't going well the way we planned. So what's down here? Tier 3. Okay, so that's important to also kind of keep in mind, is that we're going to not just try one thing and then kick the can down to tier 3. We're actually going to try one thing. We're going to come back to a meeting. We're going to talk about whether we need to adapt that same thing that we'll talk about in a little bit, or if we need to move to a different intervention. We want to have at least one little catch net here in tier 2 so that we're not just bopping from tier 2, oh, 6 weeks later, that didn't work, we're moving on to tier 3. If you do that, you're going to way over-identify for tier 3, way over-identify. We have a training where I can show you students, participants in research projects that we work with who were 7th graders and already earned 10 ODRs in the year and 7 days of out-of-school suspension, and everyone had kind of thrown their hands up. And you would have thought that was a student who needed tier 3, but we worked for 2.5 months on a few, we had to layer a few tier 2 interventions and change it a few times, and he responded to just tier 2 and was like back up at the level of all of his peers on misbehavior conduct issues. So you don't have, you've got to find something that if this one that's really easy isn't working, we can try something a little bit more intensive. So if you're thinking about the colors then on the triangle, this would be your green. This first level is like your bright solid yellow. And then we start to think of this as like an orangish color because we're more intensive in the yellow, but we're not to the red, which is usually our tier 3 color. So this is kind of orange, and then that's our yellow. That helps you make sense out of that. So our next activity is you take your actual list or your pretend list of interventions at tier 2 that you either have in your school or you think would work in your school. And I want you to start working through how you would organize them. So step 1 is organize them into domain. Which one do they work for? So you can use these if you'd like. And then start thinking through, just on your own, how you would organize those in levels of least intensive or more intensive. And what we thought through in our framework when we did this was least intensive requires the least amount of student time and teacher time and actual materials. And so if it's requiring more time of both people or either person, or requires a box of curriculum or something like that, that's going to be more intensive on that spectrum. Okay? Any questions? So if you just do your best. If you don't, nobody think they're going to get this perfect or you're afraid to do it because you're not going to get the right answer. I'm not like taking up your notes. So you get to take this back to your school and share it and work on it some more. So there's no perfect or right answer. I just want you thinking through how this would actually look like in your context, okay? So 5 minutes on that one, and then we'll get back together and keep moving on in our slides, okay? Yeah. You want this one? Yep. And then if you want me to switch it back again, just let me know. Okay, 5 minutes on that one. Thank you. Oh, honey. All righty. You guys are ready. Okay, so I will tell you, if you email me, we have a matrix that we built. I wanted you starting thinking through first what you have available already. So I can send you our matrix that's in the book, in the framework, and it'll also give you ideas for if you found any gaps when you went through your matrix and you said, uh-oh, we don't actually have anything for hyperactivity and attention. I can send you ours that's kind of done for you, and you can get some ideas of interventions there too. We're also going to be moving now into talking about those interventions and how to adapt them and why that's important. So just know, if you are still in thinking this through for the first time and thinking through what is Tier 2 for the first time and what is screening, then just like buckle up and hold on because we're moving on to some advanced stuff, but I believe in you and I believe in your capacity for absorbing what we're about to go to, okay? When we talk about Tier 2, I've already said it once, but we want to stay away from this one-size-fits-all approach. And in our field, this actually started with Fuchs and Fuchs out of Vanderbilt and RTI. They first presented us in the early 2000s with, so RTI academics, we weren't even thinking about this for behavior. We were still kicking kids out of school, right? So in RTI, Fuchs and Fuchs came up with these two different ways. They said, well, there's this one standard protocol approach. It has some advantages. And then there's this other approach you could use that we call the problem-solving approach. So they didn't tell you all as educators which one to use. They just put these two out there, and they gave you the advantages and disadvantages. So when it was time to work through Tier 2 for social emotional behavioral needs, our team thought through those as well. So here's what we're thinking on the standard protocol approach. That is, all kids in the intervention receive the same exact manualized program. This may include scripted lessons. The form is exactly the same. The procedures are exactly the same. Your advantages are, that's pretty efficient because everyone in the building just needs to learn one way how to do that. It also may help with fidelity because if we're not making a lot of changes and tinkering with it a lot, it should all look exactly the same. So when we come to observe that social skills lesson or we come to observe that check-in session with the mentee, they should all look exactly the same. So those are your advantages. But right away, you can start to think through how you might have some disadvantages when you're thinking through that approach. First is adherence. So we're all humans, and we all, as educators, can see like, oh, I could make this a little bit better for Tommy, and I can change that word, or I can change the paper to a green piece of paper, or put a superhero on the top of it, because that's what Tommy would like better. So we're all, just as humans who love kids, going to start little adaptations to that, and it's no longer standard protocol. So the adherence starts to change a little bit. And then it's an inattention to student and context factors, and that's all of what we're talking about when we're talking about adapting. So to assume that all of your students understand the exact same words, or all like the exact same form, or all like technology, or all like the football coach as their mentor, is a little bit it is giving inattention to the fact that all of your students are actually very different. They are motivated by different things. They like different things. They prefer different things. The family talks about this same thing but in a different way. So what we want to do is use adaptations that will impact social validity in a positive way. So it'll actually make Tommy want to carry around that form. Or it'll make Susie want to go meet with her mentor in the morning because it's a female and we know that she really likes relationship building with other females. So when we think about everybody gets the same thing because that's easy, we have to also consider that that might not be the best for our students. So we think through this kind of, what are we doing here? Okay, so we're thinking through a more problem-solving approach where we can make changes to our interventions. And when we do that, we're thinking through those terms I gave you the other day on malleable and non-malleable or unmalleable features. So when you're thinking about what you can change, I want you to start by taking a guess on all the different interventions on your list. There are some parts of it. Remember that prescription label that we looked at the other day? There are some parts of it you cannot change. Because if you change them, you're changing the fundamental intervention that those researchers tested it on. There are other parts that you absolutely can and should change. If you know Tommy will rip up a piece of paper and throw it in the trash, and then you have no check-in, check-out. If Tommy won't carry the piece of paper, you have no intervention. So that's one thing I forgot to mention. It's a little bit of a sticking point, but with all of Tier 2, you actually have to get the student to participate with you. So we have to make it things that they will actually do. But if you know Tommy loves his iPad, and Tommy's very fluent with Google or whatever, and would fill that out on an iPad, then change it to the iPad. Do not make him carry a piece of paper if all he's going to do is rip it up. If you have a student who, be respectful, be responsible, be safe, is like, but you can make it like exactly what they need. Solve problems peacefully, Johnny. That's what we're going to work on. Solve problems peacefully. That's technically respect and responsibility, but now we're using terms that make more sense and can get to what that student needs. So these are the adaptations that we're talking about that we want you to make. So starting to think through in your matrix, just a little bit of brainstorming now, before I show you what our adaptations that we've thought through are. And we won't take a whole 10 minutes because we'll go over time, but start to think through on all of those different things. Now you're going to have to consider resources in your building. I don't know a single school that has all iPads for all students, right? If you don't have it, then don't put it on the list as something that you'll do. But if they have Chromebooks and you can figure out a way to do it on the Chromebook, do that. So you have to make these realistic. You can't say, oh, everyone loves the principal, so the principal is going to be everybody's mentor. Well, the principal doesn't have time to be the mentor for 84 kids, so don't put that as an adaptation if it's not possible. So just start thinking through now for each one on your list, what might be changeable about that intervention that you know students or specific students might respond to better, and what you know you need to stick with and you cannot change. Okay, so another brainstorming. Let's do 3 minutes on that one for the sake of time, and then we'll get back together, and I'll show you our ideas, and maybe they'll match up. Okay? So 3 more minutes on that same list, what is malleable and what is not. All right, next, now that we've thought through that, there are things we can change and should change. There are things we should not change, because that's no longer that intervention. Just check in with yourself. If you said, we're going to do check-in, check-out, but without that piece of paper and without all that daily feedback, go back on that, because that's actually part of the intervention that you cannot change. You do have to have feedback throughout the day. So we have a lot of schools that says, oh, we'll just do the check-in, and we'll just do the check-out, and we'll call that check-in, check-out. So that is one of them, just to let you know that you cannot actually change. You have to have feedback throughout the day. You have to have that rating system. So how you do that is up to you. All right. The next concept I want you thinking through is, when do we change this? When do we adapt this? So we have the training on the actual intervention. We have a student that matches to that intervention. There are 2 time points that you have to decide when you're going to adapt. And you would decide based on different things. So we call the first time point the horizontal adaptations. So when you're first assigning that intervention to that student, prior to them ever getting it, That's when you're going to make horizontal adaptations. Those are based on student factors like gender, race, function, topography of the behavior, family dynamics, interpersonal relationships. So your initial or horizontal adaptations will be made based on student factors and then contextual factors. What we just talked about is what do you actually have available in your school? Classroom instruction, physical space, time. Do you actually have a school counselor who can pull these small groups? So based on the actual context that you work in, and then the actual student that you're meeting about and hopefully everybody at the table knows about. So your initial adaptations, you can predict they will need these adaptations before they even start on the intervention. Then you have a second time point where you can still make adaptations on a little whoopsie doodle. Things aren't going the way we thought they were, so we're going to make these vertical adaptations. So after the interventions get started, you're looking at your monthly data. The team says, oh boy, we handed Tommy that check-in, check-out card on bright orange cardstock, and it turns out Tommy does not like to be identified by his peers as someone who's on check-in, check-out, and has ripped up every single check-in, check-out card, and now we have no intervention. So if you made a little whoopsie doodle like that, it is not too late. We're not just going to move on to tier 3 and say that didn't work, right? We're going to actually make a change. We're going to say, okay, well now we know we need to reconsider those student and contextual factors. The other reason you would be changing as you go along is because things are actually going well. So if things are going well, you're going to fade that intervention little by little. This is where you can start taking away some of those fundamental components of that intervention. So one of the fading strategies for check-in, check-out is that we just do a morning check-in and we leave off that check-out. We meet again in the morning about the last day. So you can actually take away pieces of the intervention after you've implemented it to fidelity first. Part of your fading can be breaking off pieces of that intervention. The reason why we ask you to do fading rather than ripping it off like a Band-Aid and be like, woohoo, we're going to throw a party, we're back on tier 1, is because most of your interventions at tier 2 have to do with the relationship with another person that they've been getting. So you can actually introduce harm to the student by saying, great job, you've been getting along with all your friends, now you're not going to see me anymore, bye. Right? That's actually harmful for our students. So what we want to do is fade it and communicate this to them depending on developmental level and age and all that. You're doing a great job. Instead of seeing me twice a day, is it okay if we move to just in the morning? We're so proud of you. So you fade and you chip away little pieces of that intervention slowly while monitoring progress, because if you take away that afternoon checkout and the behavior comes back out, you need to monitor that because now you know he wasn't quite ready. We've got to introduce that checkout again. So you can change in intensifying, so we can go the other way. If things aren't going well, we're definitely implementing with fidelity. We definitely made all of our horizontal adaptations. It's still not seeing the progress we want. Okay, well you can take that behavior contract to a daily contract instead of a weekly contract. You can take that small group into a small group once a week and a one-on-one follow-up. So you're adding an intensity and frequency there. You can add feedback where you were doing a goal setting activity with a student and now they're going to tell you how they did after every period instead of once a week. Reinforcement, you can add that. So of course they're still accessing tier 1 reinforcement, but you could change or add reinforcement. So instead of just getting a phone call home, it could be a little gotcha ticket and a phone call home. So you can manipulate that a little bit too. And then you can always change their goals. So if on check-in, check-out, our final goal is 80% on the DPR, the daily progress report, well, if we're not doing well, just adjust it down and say, okay, we want you to meet your goal. Let's try for 45%. I know that sounds terrible, and you would actually never finally want 45%, but we have to start getting behavioral momentum. And if you're making things so difficult for them and unachievable, they're not going to participate with you. And just remember, if they do not participate with you, and you don't do your little circus dance and sell it to them, you have no intervention. So there's nothing you can do to a student at Tier 2. You have to do it with them. So we have to make these changes so that they'll participate with us. And none of Tier 2 is a gotcha. I think it's really important to say that, especially at check-in, check-out. Sometimes we see it as like, well, here they go again, not meeting their goal and never getting their reinforcement, and I'm sending a bad note home every day. You don't have a Tier 2 intervention then. All you have is another form of punishment and punitive consequences. You want to meet them where they are and show them progress, little tiny increments at a time. So if all they're doing, if they're bombing their whole day, but they actually brought their card back to you, that's progress. You met your goal because you brought your card back to me. Next week, we can make the goal about points. Right now, we just want to get this card back at the end of the day. So none of this should be a gotcha. None of this should be another form of punishment for students, okay? This is all therapeutic and restorative and instructional for them, okay? All right, so I want you to code out of your changes that you said you could make. We're going to use a little coding system. If these are features that you can change before the intervention's even assigned, circle those. And if this is something that you could do based on response or non-response, so you could adapt after it's gotten started, put an asterisk by those. Your coding system isn't that important to me. I just want you thinking through those two different ways of doing it. So again, your horizontal are things like student factors that you know about and contextual factors about your school and your community. And your vertical are anything that you thought of that you could do that either intensifies or fades that same intervention. So let's do 3 minutes on that one. Make yourself a little coding system, and out of the adaptations that you brainstormed, circle what's the horizontal initial and asterisk what you could do for ongoing. 3 more minutes on that one. All right, you guys are ready. Okay, remember how when you're in like 5th grade and you take the practice test, you actually take the test and then the teacher gives you the answers and you check your answers? Okay, that's what we're about to do. I want you to check your answers because now I'm going to give you the answers that I tried to get you to think of on your own this morning, okay? So what we're going to do next is I'm going to actually go category by category. I'm going to name the interventions that we include, and then I'm going to give you the horizontal and vertical adaptations that we include in our framework. So pretty much I just got you brainstorming what your local context would look like, and now I'm going to give you kind of the boilerplate framework and what it would look like. So when we thought through this, we thought about how this process would be kind of guiding this kind of over and over monitor and adjust, where you have your horizontal adaptations here initially, and then as you go, if a student is non-responsive, we want to always check fidelity, but that's when you intensify and you monitor and adjust. If a student is responsive, we continue the intervention, and then eventually our other option is to fade the intervention. We typically don't fade right away when we're starting to see the progress that we want. We want to hold that for a little bit. And the reason why is we always want to plan for what we call maintenance and generalization. So just to get a student to change their behavior for a week isn't enough to start fading, right? We want to try to make sure that change is really ingrained and maintained over time. And the other thing is we want to give it time to make sure that that change is generalized, which means we may see better behavior in the classroom, but do we also see that on the bus, arrival dismissal, PE, specials? So we want to kind of give it time before we start fading. We don't do that right away. So here's some research studies that we have published on this process. If you want any of these, you can email me and I can send them to you because I understand you don't have access to libraries like we do. Okay, we'll start with check-in, check-out because that's everyone's favorite Tier 2 intervention anyway, and honestly, when you do screening, you're going to see a lot of students who screen in for conduct, and the reason is the teachers are filling out the screener, and students with conduct issues are particularly bothersome for teachers. So they will definitely find your students with any conduct issues for sure, so you'll have a lot of those. So our typical components look like this over here on the left. This should all be in your notes. So if you have the PDF, you already have this. So what we cannot change initially when we're saying we're doing check-in, check-out, we've got to have all these things on the left-hand side. You may have a card that looks like this. That's your standard protocol. Then what we're going to start to think through is what we can actually change. So your core components are on the left, but what we can change is right here. So we can change the goal percentage. Typically it's 80%. We want to get to 80% eventually. We recognize that, but what we start with, or what we're doing right now, can always change. The format of the DPR, so using this card as a piece of paper rather than technology, or shrinking it down. We had one school we worked with that got really smart, and they made those cards like pocket size. So instead of a big piece of paper that students were carrying around, they could fold it up and stick it in their pocket. It was a tiny little pocket-sized card. So things like that. So your examples of adaptations are here. Hopefully, I'm giving you the answers that you guys already came up with, a lot of these yourself, right? So based on the feature that's kind of standard, you can look at whether it's changeable and then some ideas of how to change that. So let's look at that first as horizontal adaptations. Which ones would be those that we can consider student factors and contextual? So first of all, if you have thinking about age or developmental level even, or reading level. So if you have a third grader who's a non-reader, do not hand them a check-in, check-out card that has a whole bunch of words on it. That doesn't make any sense, right? Similarly, if you have an itty-bitty who's not reading yet, we would do some smiley faces, something like that. For secondary, just developmentally, we would try to shift to an electronic DPR. We could even check to peer-mediated check-in, check-out, which means the peer is the person they meet with in the morning and in the afternoon. And then you can also change your reward or reinforcement menu as well. So obviously, a sticker, a high five, those sorts of things for itty-bitties, those don't work in high school. Nobody wants a sticker anymore. So thinking through how that would change based on age. Then thinking through the type of behavior. So even within conduct, there's lots of different types of behavior that you might be trying to reset. So escaped maintained behavior, where they're trying to get out of something, you would have a system for requesting breaks. So you can get out of something, but you have to earn it or you have to request it appropriately. You can look at function-based modifications there. Some or most, I will say, of our conduct behaviors are attention maintained. So hopefully this is not a news flash to you, but children do not discriminate or care whether it's positive attention or negative attention. They could be driving you absolutely batty, and you are onto them all the time and nagging at them, and that feels the exact same as if you were telling them what a great student they are and how great of a job they're doing staying in their seat. It's literally the same. It's just attention. So it can be negative attention, positive attention. They don't care. They're getting something from you, so that's something to look at. But if you know it's attention maintained, there's some more changes we can make based on that. There's a lot of attention they already get just by having check-in, check-out. So this is an intervention that if they thrive on attention, they can get a lot of adult attention, and then peer-mediated, they could get peer attention as well. Okay? So what if there's an academic need that's kind of related to this as well? We could actually incorporate academic goals, or one academic goal in there as well, finishing your homework, studying for a test, a score on a formative assessment, something like that. You could also kind of incorporate tutoring into those check-ins. So if a student is peer-mediated, they could also go through, let's study for the test really quick. We have some time. We have algebra test today. Do you know, whatever it is. So you could try to incorporate that as well and do little mini lessons at those check-ins and check-outs. For context, you might think through available people who would be the mentors. So available staff, parents, volunteers, students. If you have secondary and you're ready for peer-mediated, relevant mentors is a really important thing. So a lot of our students jive with, or they would say vibe with, right? They vibe with a certain type of person. So it could be a person who looks like them. It could be a person who sounds like them. It could be a person from their neighborhood. It could be gender-based, whatever it is, whoever they vibe with, assign them a mentor that they would vibe with rather than somebody who's kind of, like they wouldn't really build a relationship with. And then you have your technology. If you have technology available and you can shift this to technology in your school, we would encourage you to do so. All right, so then what about the vertical adaptations for check-in, check-out? For students who respond, what we're going to start to look at is systematically reducing that teacher feedback portion times per day. So instead of 5 or 7 times per day, we move that slowly 3 times to 1 times. You see how that's just a slight shift over time. And then a fixed schedule to a variable schedule, which just means sporadically, they never know when it's going to happen. So from that card that they know every period they get the feedback, now you'll just bop in and check in on them. It'll be a random time. And then you can raise your DPR goal over time. So let's say they started out at a 10% day, a 15% day, and a 12% day. And you said, okay, that's where we are. We're not going to start at 80%. They will never meet that goal. You could start at 15%. And so then you go from 15%, they have a few successful days at that. You want them to meet their goal. And then you can move it to 17%. Then you move it to 20%. So you're moving it incrementally, tiny, 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 so that they're still experiencing success. If they are feeling frustrated and not experiencing success, not every day, but for the most part, you need to back up and go backwards. And they'll eventually stop participating with you, and then you'll have a whole bunch of new behaviors that you didn't want around escaping this check-in, check-out intervention that they hate, right? So also for students who do not respond, first, remember, we're going to check fidelity because we cannot blame a student for not responding to an intervention that they actually never got or that we didn't do our part with. So if you go to look at the student data on the DPRs for check-in, check-out, and out of a month of data, which should be 20 data points, you actually only see 7. You cannot sit there and say, well, we just knew Johnny wasn't going to respond to this check-in, check-out, so we're going to go ahead and move on to Tier 3. No, you have to back up and you have to do your job. We need to see 20 data points. You all have to do your check-in, check-out to fidelity for all those days for it to count. Otherwise, we can't even look at adapting for the student. But if we verify the fidelity is there, we've all done the intervention as it was intended to fidelity, then what we can start to do is increase feedback, modify the goal, again, going back down, and then incorporate additional Tier 2 interventions. So my friend, the 7th grader that I told you about earlier, we tried with just check-in, check-out alone first, and even though in the beginning I told the team, I'm like, this is, his SDQ score was very high. And eventually we say, okay, it's time to layer on another intervention. So it turned out he had also some really significant social issues with his peers. So we added on a graphic organizer that helped him see the situations in which he was struggling with peers. And it was a layering. So they were like, oh, we can only do one thing at a time, which we started out that way. And then we added, and that was our way of responding. Okay, so there's some more research there. We'll move to social skills training. This is in that peer problem or any human category. So we kind of chunk those together in the category that we would hope that you have available, something around social skills training or social emotional learning programs. So you can see here some examples of that standard protocol, the core components that we would traditionally have in place. Explicit instruction for a target skill, modeling, role play, teacher feedback, and generalization. These are usually curriculum. Your counselor might have them, special educators might have them. But when we think about what we can change, keeping the core components there, you'll see in the middle again, here's your malleable features, and here's some examples of those adaptations. We're going to follow the same, I'm giving you the answers again. We're going to follow that same process and start with horizontal. So what are the changes to any of those social skills interventions that we can make before the student even gets them? One is make sure that your curriculum matches the age group that you're working with. So if you are working with pre-K, first, second, make sure you're not using the third, fourth, fifth curriculum, right? The curriculum has to meet their need, and hopefully the publisher of the curriculum, then that means they've kind of modified it to use puppets instead of skits or something like that. So they should be able to, if you're buying a curriculum or getting something off the internet, just make sure it's developmentally appropriate. Also, you can change your groupings from the beginning. So I don't think it's any mystery to you all, but when you put a group of students who don't get along with peers all together, you can expect you're going to have some issues in your little small group. So if you want to balance that out, you could do so. You could also make it based on, this is a group of athletes who always have sportsmanship issues on the playground. So you can make it a sportsmanship group. You can make it a girls group, a mean girls group, you wouldn't call it that, but like 7th graders who are not very nice to each other. And just know that they may learn some things from each other. You might have some conflict in the group, but thinking through the topics of your groups, the compositions of your groups very intentionally instead of just randomly. What we usually see is like, we'll just pull whoever's available for 4th period, whoever has elective in 4th period, we're going to pull those people together. And if there's a way to be a little bit more intentional and plan for that, it'd be good. And then make sure you're teaching at tier 2. In this area, we're not starting at lesson 1 and going through lesson 72. Probably they need lesson or unit 12 and 12 only. So when you look at a social skills curriculum or SEL curriculum, they have everything under the sun there, right? So picking a group of students who all need conflict resolution or communication or something about tattling, whatever it is, you pull those units or those lessons that apply to those needs only, because again, these are students who are spending time with you in small group rather than in their instruction. So we want it to be kind of fine-tuned and targeted to what they actually need. Based on your context, you have to consider who's available to teach the lessons, when would we teach them, where will we teach them, what materials do we need. Do we need to add something at the universal level? So for anyone that has tier 2 that's above 30–40% of your school, it may be time to layer on some of those supports universally to all students. And I know it's not really popular for me to say that, but if you have so many students with targeted identified needs, you can push some of that up universally for all students. Social emotional learning, social skills will not harm a single student in your building. So if everyone gets it and some students don't exactly need it, they're just hearing it again and it's getting reinforced. Technology, there are some technology-based, this is kind of weird that us humans have figured this out, just to let you know, I think it's weird that you can actually learn social skills from a computer. It doesn't really track, but there are computer-based or online social skills programs if that's the only way you could do this or it would work best in your context. So after you get going and you see student progress and you're having these monthly meetings, our vertical adaptation options then, for students who are responding, we can take that we're doing well in small group and we can go practice it in new settings. So we can practice it at recess, we can practice that in the classroom, we can practice that at lunch. We can practice it with new people as well, and then new materials or under different circumstances. Then you can also tinker with the dosage and eventually fade that intervention off. So instead of 60-minute lessons, your group is going to be a 20-minute review once a week. You've been through the unit, now we're going to keep meeting, but we're going to shift that to just a little 20-minute lunch check-in instead. You could also, instead of once a week, move to every other week. So changing the frequency of the sessions, and then you could also kind of let some students graduate out of your group, and those that still need to stay in can stay, and you make your other students who are performing that new skill well, your graduates, and they can move out, so your group size changes. For students who do not respond, and I'm just going to let you know this is going to happen. It doesn't mean that you did a bad job or you did match the wrong intervention. As long as the fidelity is there, this is going to happen. Some students are going to need a more intensive version of that intervention. So you can increase session length instead of 45 minutes, moving it to 60 minutes. Provide more opportunities for practice and feedback. So maybe that counselor goes and kind of shadows that student and gives them feedback throughout the day more often. You could add additional lessons with explicit instruction needed for other skills. You might get in group and realize, oh, a couple of my students don't even have the foundational skills we're talking about, manners, or if you're talking about kind of advanced communication, you might have to pull a few for some foundational skills as well. And then you can change the intervention, change the setting, change the participants, change the instructor, if your person who's delivering the intervention is not vibing with the students, you might have to look at that. I will say just in general for Tier 2, do not assign Tier 2 to any grouchy, I know maybe not everybody has grouchy teachers in their building, but if you do, if you have any grouchy teachers or adults in your building who don't necessarily like children, do not make them in charge of Tier 2. So find someone else to do Tier 2, because that not that it exists, but in case it does, that would be a problem. You might have to change the grown-up if they're not vibing. So we have a research article on that one there, and some adaptations just to social skills training programs. The next is self-monitoring. So under that hyperactivity inattention category that we talked about, the academic related behaviors, our kind of core foundational intervention is self-monitoring. And self-monitoring can be pretty complicated. It's actually just one period of the day or one time point in the day. And the student, what we're trying to do is teach them to recognize, what am I supposed to do? What am I doing right now? Am I in my seat or am I out of my seat? And then if I'm out of my seat, I need to get back in my seat. So for students with these needs, they're used to teachers and parents being their external locus of control. So their body's doing whatever their body's doing, and someone they're used to will tell them, Johnny, you're out of your seat, get back in your seat. Johnny, raise your hand. How many times do I have to tell you to raise your hand? So that's all external locus of control, and for these interventions, they're specifically designed to help the student build their own internal locus of control, which means it's all about self-monitoring. So we have to teach them what it looks like. We have to teach them regular intervals of figuring out, am I in my seat, not in seat, and then how to fix that as well. So you'll see that you have your core components. You have some malleable features here to self-monitoring, and then we'll go through these just like we did the others. So starting with student and contextual factors, age. Now this, one thing we say when we train on self-monitoring is make sure the student is even capable of understanding internal locus of control and regulating. So we would never use self-monitoring for, let's say, talkative behavior for 4-year-olds. Do you want to know why? All 4-year-olds are talkative, and that's how they're supposed to be. So we have to think through their age when we're coming to these more internal regulation skills we want them to develop. Is it even an appropriate skill? So we can also think through also how we're talking about that with them. So it might mean they're really wiggly, they're out of seat a lot. Okay, they need movement. Their body needs movement. Just give them movement breaks. It might be that we need picture representations again instead of words. And then for middle and secondary, there's some really cool self-monitoring apps that are being developed that are out there. One off the top of my head is called MobiGo. I can send you more if you want. But anyway, where it's on technology, the technology lights up when it's time for them to rate. And the technology might say, are you on task or off task? And they have to figure that out, and then they push the button. And then it tells them again when the interval has gone off, it's time to rate again. Am I on task or off task? And all that data goes into the system. That's actually your progress monitoring data that gets pulled to see about progress as well. So you might also incorporate peer feedback. You might think through types of behavior. So on these, do consider that some of your students just, that not raising the hand and talking out and being the class clown, that could actually be a function of a student who really likes your attention. You have to sort that out and think through how you would adapt for that. Some of our students also who are, again, it doesn't matter if it's negative attention or positive attention, but some of our students really kind of get energized when their peers are all laughing at them or the peers are all staring at them, waiting to see what happens next. They're actually getting something from that, so we can modify based on that. And then just know, especially around academics, especially if the student has an academic need also, they're going to be trying to escape that academic instruction, so you can work with that as well. For reinforcement, students like different things. They respond to different systems of reinforcement as well. So you'll have to kind of think through what you're reinforcing for. Just the procedure of monitoring, or the actual percentage of on task versus off task, or if a specific goal was met. You can use differential reinforcement of other behavior. This is kind of like master's level behavior management stuff for you, but you could actually ignore the problem behavior and reinforce all their other behaviors. So especially if it's maintained by attention and they're tapping, right? And it drives you crazy because you can't think about your algebra lesson because they're tapping. This is like a Jedi mind trick that I'm asking you to do, but you have to ignore the tapping, but say, what a great job you're doing, eyes on me, thank you so much for staying in your seat. And next thing you know, the tapping goes away because they're getting the attention they need, but not from the tapping, right? So that's DRO, or differential reinforcement of other behavior. And then you have differential reinforcement of alternate behavior. You can ignore that. You can reinforce other students who are not tapping and keeping their hands in their lap or very quiet. So you could do that as well. So all those kind of little Jedi mind tricks can come in there. You could incorporate an academic need. You could allow choice in activities as well. If a student, because these are all academic related behaviors to instruction. If you have technology, oh, here's a list of these. So MobiGo is one, Score It, and then there's another one, iConnect. Here's the issue that I always think with these. This is another I was using logic issue, is if a student is off task a lot, and then you give them a piece of technology on their desk to try to keep them on task, you can imagine it opens up an opportunity for the next thing you know, they're down a rabbit hole on YouTube on this device rather than using it for the thing you were trying to get them on task with, right? So this is a picture of a phone. I would absolutely say do not let them get out their phone because 100% they're not going to be on task even worse than they were before. But if you have tablets or a Chromebook or there's some way to do that, that you can remove all the other distractions, that would be good. All right, so you've implemented self-monitoring, you've made those initial adaptations. The things on your list around being fading and responding to students who are doing well, you could actually decrease the cues. So instead of telling them 5 times a period to rate, you could go down to 3 and then down to 1. You could decrease the opportunities for reinforcement. So instead of reinforcing every day, they could make a weekly goal, something like that, change that schedule, and then you can also increase their goal that they're expected to stay in the seat or raise their hand or complete their work. So you can change all of those things if they are responding and kind of make it a little bit more difficult for them. If they are not responding, you're pretty much going to do the opposite of what I just said. So you're going to increase the cues. So instead of every 5 minutes, you're going to go down to every 1 minute. You might go to every 30 seconds after that, but that's what they might need to train their brains to regulate and remember that they need to check whether they're in their seat and then they need to fix that, right? So you could increase opportunities for reinforcement and increase teacher feedback as well. So just in the exact opposite direction we just talked about. And there's a research article on adapting and self-monitoring there. All right, so we went through those big categories. The next question you might be thinking of is how would you know what adaptations to make for each student? One thing we need to look at is what do you even have available at your school? You're probably going to take a bunch of things off the table just based on, unfortunately, what you have available at your school. There's a great Tier 2 intervention called Check, Connect, and Expect. I did my dissertation on it. It's very, very powerful. However, it requires a full-time behavior coach. And if you don't have a full-time behavior coach, that is their job. They are the Tier 2 behavior coach. And that's all they do. They're not also a teacher. They're not also the reading coach. They're not also a social worker. That's their job. If you don't have that, that takes that intervention off the table, right? So think through what's available. And the next, and I hope you're doing this already, and this might take kind of into the year, so it might take time, but knowledge of student, knowledge of family, knowledge of community. So this is the kind of a delicate area to talk to you about, but I do want you to consider that you have to get to know the actual student you're serving and try to get to know their family as well. If we're the educators, we see them during the day, and sometimes we start thinking we really know that student really well. We've figured them out. But guess what? That's students with you for 6 hours, but they have a whole community they live in. They have a neighborhood, a house, they have siblings, they have a sports team. So getting to know the full picture of the student and then asking our family members, how do you talk about this at home? What do you see at home? What does Johnny like to do in his free time? So actually becoming partners with your students and with your family will help get to know them. And especially if you don't live in the community in which you teach, it would be good for you to also get to know the community, what's important in the community. Like I said, the students are saying vibe instead of like what jive, whatever I just said was like 1950s. But so like talk the way the students talk. Explain it to them in the way that makes sense to them. And that takes a little bit of effort on your part, but it also requires a lot of humility on your part that like you don't know everything, and that's okay because we want this to work and we want them to see them as partners. So we're not going to do this activity, but I do want you thinking through ways in which you can get to know students. So definitely one-on-one. What about beginning of the year surveys? You could get to know their preferences. You could get to know their interests. A little about me. I know we usually do that in elementary school and then it stops and I'm not quite sure why. I have a 7th grade son and he told me into 6th grade, we were in like October, November, and I said something about, oh, well, you just email the teacher. You've got to, just email the teacher about that, whatever we were talking about. And October, November, he said, my teachers don't even know my name. Like, they're not going to know who this is coming from. So even middle school and high school, all about me, personal biography, autobiography, like those activities, we want you to actually get to know your students. If you don't know them, you're not going to be able to make these changes. And then you're going to lose buy-in and you're going to have no intervention. You'll feel a lot of frustration. Okay, this is the final lecture is on fidelity. I've mentioned it several times. Remember in our graphic, we were checking if a student is not responding, make sure you're checking fidelity. It can be pretty harmful for a student to go through your system and for the grown-ups to say, well, he didn't respond. And it actually turns out someone didn't do their job, right? So we have to make sure that you're monitoring fidelity. And that could be that you come up with a checklist. We have checklists available if you want some. But what your fidelity has to at least address, let me get to an example here. Your fidelity checklists have to have these on them. So if all you're doing is going back to those core components that I gave you, that has to be there. That's what we would call to fidelity, is if these were there. Right? So if you just come up with a checklist, in self-monitoring, you could check their forms. In check and check out, you could check their DPR forms. In social skills, you might have to go observe a lesson. But anything that we said was core component, that has to be there. That's the pieces of the intervention that have to be implemented with fidelity. If you do not implement with fidelity, you either just got lucky if things went well, or things did not go well and it wasn't the student's fault. There will still be students who don't respond at Tier 2 to fidelity and do move on to Tier 3. That is also totally fine. We just want to make sure that within that and within those discussions and in those data meetings, you're considering whether or not the intervention was implemented with fidelity. Okay? So there's a little decision tree. If you start at the top, go over there for no, over there for yes, and then it'll give you kind of your answers there. Last one here, here's some more articles that we have. I'm like really filling up your reading list for the entire winter season, but if you want to read any of this, I have all of these different articles here too. And then the last thing I'll leave you with is the book. The book actually has all of this and all of how to do the interventions and screening. You'll see here, this is the table of contents. So the book actually starts with a preface where we say 13 years ago when we started this, we didn't expect a global pandemic, but here we are, so let's do this now because we're in a crisis. And then we have just basics of Tier 2 for social emotional behavioral needs. What's the logic? What's the purpose? And how would you know that you're ready to implement Tier 2? And then we go through the identification process, so screening, considering other data forms like ODR, attendance, academic data. And then the initial matching, so the initial matching we talked about is in Chapter 3. Then we go through interventions for each of those categories that we talked about. And in chapter 8, we're talking about integrating academics, and then database decision making, ongoing adaptations that we talked about, those for responding and non-responding, and then TA to facilitate fidelity. We talked about how that was important, and then some really important final considerations when you're talking about tier 2. So that's the QR code for the Guilford. It's not to press yet, which just means that they haven't actually printed it yet. We sent off just a few changes last week, so they'll be printing it soon. And the cover's there on the left. It's really pretty, but all of that is in the book. And also, if you have questions, you can email me too. So I am here on the top, and all of my great colleagues are down here as well. So if you have any questions, or if you can't get the slides, or there was something I mentioned that you wanted, email me here. Just know that I'm about to head to the airport, so if you all inundate me right this second, I can promise to get back to you Monday or so. So with that, I hope you all had a great conference and have a safe travels home. And remember to do all the things that Melissa told you to do, which was, yeah, go.
Yep. All right. Join me in thanking Dr. McDaniel for her wonderful session. Thank you so much. With a cold and everything, she was great.